Thank you. Now you can hear me. You could hear me before though, right? I was loud. Now I'm really loud. So, all right. Quick few things. You may notice some things look a little different around here. We are done with the phase one of changes to the building, the physical building of this church, and it's a lot of help from volunteers making this happen. So I just want to thank everyone who helped through the last couple of weeks as we painted and moved stuff and built the floor, or had the floor put in and moved more things and moved more things back and organized things. It's been a crazy 2 weeks. It's going to be nice to have a little bit calmer week maybe. But just I want to thank you for everyone that was here. It was a blessing to have everyone helping out. On that note, this floor is not the last carpet, right? This floor has a little bit more resiliency. So if you spill something, try to get it cleaned up as quick as possible. Let someone know. We'll get it cleaned up, but it should hold up a little easier than the previous carpet. Next thing, the last Sunday of each month, we're going to be starting this up here. If there's something in the fridge that doesn't belong to the church for like church stuff going on, it's going to get removed. So unless there's some kind of event or something like that that's in there for that we're knowing about, at the end of each month, Tenley is going to take care of everything in the fridge so it gets cleaned out a little bit more often. And she wanted to make sure that everyone knows that. So, yeah, all right. That's all my little announcements, I guess. Anyway, I don't think I forgot anything. But, okay. We are going through Romans, as you have been here. And we're trying not to miss any verses along the way. And some of you may keep track of that. Maybe, like, you're double checking, make sure we're getting every verse. I appreciate that if you do. We're still in chapter 1, and I'm going to talk about a couple of verses this morning that are really kind of the anchor verses of this book of Romans, right? Of this letter to Rome. And we'll come back to them and unpack them in the weeks and months ahead. And but we're going to be talking about Romans chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. And here's how I want to get into this. I want to bring to mind something that you probably don't want to bring to your mind, okay? And that is an embarrassing moment in your life, right? I mean, we've all had embarrassing moments, and how you respond to those embarrassing moments when something happens, right? It's embarrassing, right? And there's researchers, they have done some research, right? That's what they do, is research, on this. They would say that embarrassing moments have one thing in common, right? That they involve unwanted attention, right? Meaning that if I'm walking down the sidewalk and I trip on something, if I trip on it, and there's nothing there, I just tripped on thin air, right? First thing I do is you look around, like, anyone see me? Because if no one saw you, then it's no big deal. You just keep going. But if someone saw me trip over nothing, you kind of have to go, okay, you kind of look back like, oh man, there's a crack there or something, right? The earth moved for a second, and you take a look at that spot and you pretend like there's something there, right? And there must be a reason I tripped, because I'm aware that other people are watching, and that's what makes it embarrassing, right? And there are a lot of examples of this. I mean, you can spill your drink at dinner, rip your pants in public. You might push on a door that says pull, or maybe you pull on a door that says push. And or maybe your stomach growls too loudly in church service, right? Like, we all have these embarrassing moments, and what makes them embarrassing is the unwanted attention from others. It's this unwanted attention. And so what comes to my mind is a moment early in my military life when I was younger. I was early, like this is like week 2 of being in the military. So I didn't know stuff yet, right? I was still learning, but it was embarrassing. So in the military, you salute, like commanding officers, an officer in general, you salute them as a enlisted, or anyone above you. And we're just getting used to that process. And I was in the chow hall, right? Indoors, cafeteria. It's stressful. They have you on the clock. You can eat, and they have like 4 minutes to eat, right? You have to clean your plate. And it's just all stressful, right? It's just a bunch of stress. And I'm carrying my tray because I'm done. And I get up there, and my commanding officer is right there. So I salute him, right? And you think, well, that's, okay, you're supposed to salute your officers. Yeah, you're not supposed to salute indoors, okay? That's a no-no. And so I had this whole chow hall full of all my peers, right, all the other soldiers I'm with, and I'm saluting the officer, and it was very, very embarrassing. And of course, my drill instructor had to make it even more embarrassing later that day, and he just kind of made fun of me the rest of the day. So, but that was an embarrassing moment, right? I had a lot of eyes on me. Well, there's another embarrassing story. I don't know if you can relate to this one. I'm sure my dad will remember this one. I was riding a four-wheeler, right? We were on a trip. There's a bunch of guys. We're on a four-wheeler, and I'm riding on we're on like the top of a mountain. Okay, it's not really. It's Oklahoma mountains, hills. Okay, so we're right on the crest of and there's like a trail, and we're going. It's a hot day, right? It's Oklahoma. It's hot, even in November or whenever it was, and it was like monotonous, like the movement of going over the bumps in the road. It was just, and all of a sudden I fell asleep, right? I fell asleep. For a split second I fell asleep, and I fell off my four-wheeler. People saw me, right? So I got right back up and ran. It was still moving, and I ran and jumped on and kept going like nothing ever happened. And we got back to camp, and I'm sure I got what happened there? Oh, that was embarrassing, right? That's embarrassing. So, and this is just the instinctual response to embarrassing moments is we want to blend in, right? We want to not be noticed. Like in that chow hall, I wanted just to disappear. Thankfully, I was wearing camouflage. Or like disappear to everybody else, right? And what I would tell you is, for the believers in Rome, they were getting this unwanted attention, right? Some embarrassment. Because of the gospel they believed, and the instinct for them would have been to say, there's nothing to see here. Don't look at us. Let's just go in hiding and be Christians. Let's not draw any more attention to ourselves than we already have. But Paul is going to double down on the gospel and say, look, I'm not ashamed of it, and neither should you be. And he starts this letter this way because he's going to say some things I think probably would have been embarrassing to believe in that culture at that time. It would have been embarrassing. And we're going to study some of these things as we study Romans, where you're going to think to yourself, did he just say that? Right? So Paul wants to set that up. He's like, look, yeah, we're going to talk about some things that might not go too well. Like they might not go over well in the world that you're living in. And whether that's Rome or our Western world today, but I'm not ashamed of it, right? We don't need to be ashamed of it. And so Romans 1:16 and 17 says this. Here's what he says. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. What do you think that means? Right? A righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as is written, the righteous will live by faith. Paul says, I'm not ashamed of this gospel. Now, it gives a few reasons here that I want to draw your attention to help give us courage and conviction in our world. He says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's inherent in his statement that it's because it's good news, right? The gospel is good news. That's what it means, right? Good news, gospel, same thing, you interchange them. In fact, it might even have been translated, your translation that you have right now might even say good news versus gospel, right? And if you think about it, it would be really odd to be ashamed of good news, right? It's really odd. Who's embarrassed about good news, right? It's like if you're a doctor, right? And you're walking in, you have a patient who's been dealing with some kind of illness, and they've tried to figure it out, what's wrong, and they've tried different treatments, and nothing's worked, and they've come to you to see what you can do as a doctor, right? The specialized doctor, and you know what's wrong, and you know how to treat it. You know how to cure it. That's something you're not ashamed to tell them, that you know how to cure this disease. Now, yes, hearing their sickness may not be easy for them to hear, but you got the cure, so you have to say, here's what's wrong with you, and here is how you fix it. And it's good news, right? That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to be proud of, something to be thankful that you can share the gospel, that this gospel is good news. It reveals our sin and our sickness. It tells us the truth about which that can be hard, right? It can be hard to hear, but it also gives us the cure for what's hard to hear. And so we can celebrate. We can celebrate the good news, celebrate the gospel. So the word gospel translates good news, gospel, right? And we hear the word gospel and we put into a spiritual context, right? That's what we do as Christians. We hear it in church. You don't hear the word gospel that often in the regular world. And like if you hear gospel, chances are you connect that to the church. But for those living in Rome at the time, that's not what they thought of when they hear the word gospel, right? That's in the context they have in their minds. It's a political word. It's something that would have been used in the political situations. Because the gospel, the way they understood it, would be the good news proclaimed in the town square about something political, right? So a new emperor comes on the scene, and there's a new person. There's a person that's called a herald, right? And the herald will go out heralding, proclaiming, saying, look, here's the good news. Such and such is the new emperor. There's a new Caesar. There's a new king. And that's how they understood the word gospel. Like more in a political message rather than a spiritual message. But Paul says, look, here's some good news about a new king. And his name is Jesus. And Paul says, I'm not ashamed of it. I'm going to herald this message of Jesus being the king. That's not a job that you can be timid with, right? It's not like, yay, there's a new emperor out there, right? Yay, everybody. No, you're like, if you're going to be the person that shares the good news, you're going to be excited about it. And Paul says, I'm not ashamed because it's good news. I'll be the herald. The second thing, he says, I'm not ashamed because it's for everyone. It's for everyone. Like, if I have a party and just invite a few people, I might not make a big deal about it, right? Probably won't announce it, won't post anything about it, right? But if it's for everyone, I'm not ashamed of it. Let's invite everybody, right? Like, if it's for everyone, I'm not going to keep it a secret. I'll get up and I'll tell everyone, hey, you're invited. And this is true of the gospel. The gospel is for everyone. Now, it's for everyone who believes, but everyone gets an invitation to believe, okay? And it's not just like, okay, you don't have to believe. It's just for everyone who believes, right? The invitation is universal. The power of salvation is limited to those who believe in it, right? And Paul says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. And we'll see that language as we study Romans. It's not about priority. It's about chronology, right? It's just a way of saying everyone's included. So the Jew to the Gentile, right? First Jew. It's just chronologically. That's all they're showing. And you might have thoughts that some people think, well, maybe this was a Jewish thing. It's not just a Jewish thing. It's a Jew and Gentile thing. Because it's for everyone. That when he says that, it includes everyone, right? Because Gentiles are anyone who aren't Jews, right? So it includes everyone. Everyone gets the invitation to believe. I'm not ashamed because it's for everyone. And Paul says here, he's like, it brings salvation to everyone who believes. It doesn't say it brings salvation to everyone who behaves. Okay? I think some of us grew up with that kind of understanding of the gospel, that it's this power of salvation to everyone who behaves properly, right? Who's religious enough, who follows the rules. You're a good boy, you're a good girl. The gospel's for you. That's not the gospel, if that's what you heard. The gospel is for everyone who believes. So no matter how you have behaved, the gospel is still for you. Now, it calls us to live a righteous life, right? It changes our affections in our life. But it's for everyone who believes. And for the people living in Rome, this would have been hard to hear, right? This has been a challenge. It would have been hard to bear because in Rome, it wasn't acceptable to say, this is the way. A few things about Roman culture that would have made it easy for those believers to be a little embarrassed is this. First, Rome was a very polytheistic culture. You may not know what that word means. They worshiped many gods in Rome, right? And so in Rome, the only thing they didn't tolerate was intolerance. Like, so you can believe anything you want to believe as long as you don't believe that's the only thing you can believe in, right? I know, it sounds goofy to me too. As long as you don't believe that, your way is the only way. You can believe it. And so if the Christians would have come in and said, hey, we believe in Jesus, he is the one we worship, the Romans would have been like, yeah, cool, you do you, that's fine. Like, whatever, like, you got your God, we got our gods, that's fine. The problem became that the Christians believe in one true God, and that there's one way to God, and that's through Jesus. He is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. Amen. That would not have gone over very well in Rome. In fact, it's interesting, the people living in Rome at that time called Christians atheists. Christians were literally called atheists because they only believed in one God. They just thought, that's so weird to only believe in one God. Another reason why this might have been a little more embarrassing in this culture is that Rome was really a hedonistic culture. It would have been hard to overstate the level of sexual depravity in Rome. And I'm not going to go into examples this week, but we'll look at a couple of things in a couple of weeks in a little more in depth. But the sexual depravity in Rome at this time was on such a level that would have been, it wouldn't have been acceptable, or for that matter, probably even legal in our world today. Not just in America, but in our world. The believers to be a little bit embarrassed because of their sexual ethics that they were brought up in. They knew that their sexual ethics was an indictment on everybody else. That they knew that their sexual ethics is one of the things that differentiated them with the rest of the culture. It would have been tempting to just say, oh, let's not make a big deal about this. But Paul's going to make a big deal out of it. Third, Rome was a city that worshiped power. Right? They worshiped power. So if you go to Rome, you'll see statues, lots of statues. Images of rulers, gods they worshipped power. Christians worshipped a God who died on a cross. It's embarrassing. In that culture, for Romans, dying on the cross would have been the most demeaning way to die. In fact, Paul, who's a Roman citizen, when he's executed, he's not crucified because he is a Roman citizen, right? He's not allowed to be crucified. It's too demeaning, it's too belittling. So Paul was beheaded. Jesus died the most demeaning death, and now these believers in this culture of power are saying, this is who we worship. Well, that's not too attractive to the people in Rome. And so you can see why maybe it would have been tempting for them to not want the attention. Just to withdraw, right? Away from the public view. It's especially so because Nero is on the scene as emperor, and he's emperor, and he's a few years away from burning the city down, burning Rome down, and blaming the Christians for it. And then going on a massive persecution of the early church. And so they were feeling that pressure. Like, it would have been easy just to say, we're going to take a step back. We're going to take a step back here, and we're just going to go into hiding a little bit. Paul says, I am not ashamed. I'm not ashamed because it's good news. I'm not ashamed because it's for everyone. And I am not ashamed because it's powerful. And in verse 16 he says, it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. The power of God. Doesn't say that the gospel tells us the power of God. Doesn't say that the power of God doesn't say that the gospel tells us the power of God. It doesn't say that the gospel shows us the power of God. It says that the power of God, like the good news about Jesus, has power in it. That's what it is. So we have a tendency to do is that we think that's not quite enough. And so, we'll take the gospel, the good news, and, we'll we'll kind of turn it into good advice, right? We'll turn it into good advice because that feels a little more empowering to turn to good advice. Like we can apply that to a little easier, right? So we come to church, we open our Bibles, and it's not so much about the good news, it's about good advice. But the gospel is not good advice. The gospel is good news. Doesn't mean that there isn't good advice in the Bible. Don't get me wrong. Sure, there's a lot of truth to meditate on in the Bible and to apply to your life, but it's not what changes you or transforms you. It's the gospel that does that. And so all of the good advice so all of that good advice has to be built on a foundation of the good news. But sometimes I think we rob the gospel of its power, right? By treating it like good advice instead of the good news. What happens oftentimes in the church is that because we can be a little embarrassed about how countercultural Scripture can be, right? We'll try to water it down just to make it easier for people to swallow. I mean, meaning well, but in doing so, we often rob the gospel of the good news, of its power. Like we're just trying to make it a little more palatable, just a little easier to swallow, so we water it down. There's a news story about a pharmacist named Robert Courtney who went to prison, right? Because he watered down, he diluted chemo medication for patients. 98,000 prescriptions affected. 4,200 patients, right? There were 17 patients that died because they got watered down chemotherapy treatments. It's a watered down medication. He made about $19 million from that fraud. And he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Now, if you would have talked to Robert Courtney at the beginning of that, my gut is that he had a way of justifying it. Like, he would say, oh, listen, it's overprescribed. It's just so hard to see these people physically. I see how hard it is on their bodies when they take this medication. Yeah, I do benefit from it, but I also think that it's what's best for them. Like, I imagine he had some ways initially just to kind of explain it all, right? Explain the way, but it's evil because here's someone who was trusted with the power to save, trusted with this life-saving medication, and he watered it down so much so that it lost its power. And so when we do that as believers, we might have some different ways to justify it, right? Like, look, it's a lot for people to handle, right? This whole baptism thing, it's a lot, right? I can see it's hard on folks when we talk about sin in this way, so let's just soften up a little bit. Let's just massage these things into our culture so it feels a little easier to handle. But we're robbing the gospel of the power to save people. It can be hard to receive because it's an indictment on us, but it's also what saves us. So what I think we end up doing sometimes is we settle for something less than the gospel with that kind of power. We settle sometimes, I think, for this feel-good emotionalism, where you come to church and you decide whether or not it's a good morning based on did it make me feel good. Or we settle for, instead of the power of the gospel, for some inspiring platitudes like, what can I put up on the screen that might get reposted, right? Be really inspirational. I mean, there's nothing wrong with feeling good, right? Nothing wrong with having some inspiring platitudes, but there's no power in those things to save us. Or we settle for self-help. Some version of that, I think if you ask someone who does that, I think they would just say, hey, well, look, I'm just trying to be relevant, right? I just want to be relevant to this culture. But here's what I would say, and I think what was hard for the people in Rome to understand, and it's probably hard for us too. We'll probably need to remind each other of this along the way, but what makes the gospel relevant is not that it's like our culture, it's that it's not like our culture, right? Like, that's what makes it powerful. If the gospel was saying that what everyone else says, then there's no power in that. Like, what makes it powerful is it's not like our culture, it's that it's not like our culture. And so, instead of being ashamed of how it's different, we are unashamed because this is where it's powerful. And so as a church, we don't try to stay relevant by reframing God's word based on popular opinion or by celebrity comments like this progressive theology that's out there, where you look at Scripture through the lens of culture and you try to make it fit into the conversation. Make everything kind of copacetic so it's not threatening to people. Let me give you a quick example of what I think this looks like, and I think this example is not awesome, but it's the best I can come up with. You ever been down in a shopping area in a tourist location? Oh, like maybe in Mexico or someplace, and it seems like all the shops, they're all selling the same things, right? You go from one booth to the next or whatever, they sell the same trinkets, right? And I heard a story of a man who was shopping at one of these, and he just talked to the person. He goes, he asked the store owner, why don't you sell something different? The shop owner said, well, it's what everyone is buying. But maybe if you sold something different, they'd buy that too. I don't know. But I mean, he's a professional. It's his shop. I won't argue with him. I wouldn't argue with him. But what I would say is if you are offering what everyone else is offering, you're irrelevant. And so this is what happens with churches who are so concerned with fitting into the market. They start dying because they're not offering anything distinctive. And they may be bigger, but they're dying inside. It's just not the same thing that the world offers. Now listen to me, the church isn't a store. The gospel is not a product. It's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that our consumer-based culture, where everything around us is trying to make people comfortable and say, here's how we can make your life better, and here's what you need. You can have it your way, right? When the church has that same posture, we're irrelevant. We're just doing what everyone else does. We're not offering anything different. And the gospel, were it to have the power to save, it cannot be watered down. D.A. Carson, he's a theologian up in Canada, he said it this way, this process of watering down the gospel, he calls it domesticating the gospel. I like that one. And here's what I would say, that we domesticate the gospel when we talk about God, but we don't talk about Jesus. We domesticate the gospel when we turn the message of surrender into a message of self-empowerment and self-help. We domesticate the gospel when we preach about salvation, but we don't talk about sin. We domesticate the gospel when we are more concerned with offending someone than we are saving someone. We domesticate the gospel when we leave out the uncomfortable parts because we want people to like us. We domesticate the gospel when we shrink the message, the mission of the church down to meeting my needs and preferences, making me feel good. We domesticate the gospel by making nothing more than a moral code, list of do's and don'ts. We domesticate the gospel when we talk about a relationship with Jesus apologetically, where we say, hey, here's what it takes to follow Jesus. I know it's a lot to ask. Don't do that. We domesticate the gospel when we put it in a box called religion. We domesticate the gospel when we say Jesus is good, but he isn't good enough. We're going to have to earn this on your own. We domesticate the gospel when we're more concerned about being on the right side of history than the right side of eternity. We domesticate the gospel when we make it sound less like good news and more like a raw deal, and when we do that, we rob it of its power. Now, what I would say is that I think for a lot of us, and I'll just speak for me, there's a lot of times that I feel ashamed. I'll admit it. It happens. I don't know if I want to say it this way, or I don't want to offend the person. I'm getting better at that as time goes on, as I get older. But I would say is that when I do that, it's because I'm not believing in the power that I have experienced myself in my life. And if I stop and think about what the gospel has done for me, I'm not ashamed. When I think about the sins that God has forgiven in my life, when I think about the way that he's changed my heart and the way he's changed the hearts of people that I know and love, when I think about how he saved, I am not ashamed. Because I believe it. I really believe it. I think for us, it's time for us to be, the word is herald. I'm not ashamed. I'll proclaim it. I'll speak it. I'll say it even if it's not popular. Even if people don't understand, I just want to challenge you this week to be a herald for the gospel. There's some ways you can do that. I'm going to give them to you. When you go and ask a friend how you can pray for them, you're doing it. You're being a herald. When you check in on a coworker you know is going through a difficult time and they know about your love of Jesus, and you check in on them and show care for them, they connect to that. They connect that to Jesus. When you invite a neighbor to come to church with you, that's being a herald. When you bow your head and say a prayer at a business lunch, even though it might feel a little embarrassing, you're being a herald. When you're being baptized, oh yeah, that's what that is. It's a proclamation of the gospel. When someone is baptized, they are saying, I believe, I'm not ashamed of this gospel news, this great news. I believe in the gospel. Jesus died and rose again, and I'm putting all my hope and all my trust in him. And when you do that, here's what happens. I mean, it happens most of the time, right? I mean, it happens all the time. It's the most common baptism story that you hear out there. Someone comes because someone they know is getting baptized. They just want to be supportive, right? They get invited to come to it. But then they start thinking, and before you know it, they're the ones getting baptized. They're in the baptistry, right, getting baptized. And now they got some of their family and friends showing up. It's a proclamation of the gospel. One way you can be a herald these days is on social media. Not TikTok today, but every other social media. And I would just challenge you to do this. I'm not a big social media guy. I will try to do it more. I'm going to make a commitment in front of everybody. I'm going to try to be on social media a little bit more. Not a lot, a little bit more. And do this. Now I would challenge you to do this. Like whether it's posting a scripture, it's a proclamation. Just lets people know in your circle know, like, oh, he's not ashamed of the gospel. She believes in the power of Jesus. Or you go to a game or a concert. Chances are you post something like that, like you're active on social media, right? I would challenge you to do that when you go to church, when you come to church. Post, hey, we went to church today. This is what we learned. Like that's the easy, great way to just proclaim, I am not ashamed of this. I'm not ashamed to be a believer of Jesus. Now I know this week we'll all have opportunities to be ashamed of the gospel. But don't be. Don't be, because there's power in it. It is the power of salvation that the gospel brings. Don't be ashamed. I am not ashamed of the gospel. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you. We thank you for the power of salvation. We know we're not perfect. We know we have a lot of sin in our lives. Help us to just know that it's through your power that we don't have to be ashamed of that. Because the strength is in your name. You have overcome. And you are our God. And Jesus is our King. And we don't need to be ashamed of that at all. Help us to go out and glorify your name this week. Help us to be your herald this week. And let those around us know that you are a great and loving God. And there is good news